"Get that rusted piece of junk out of my parking spot before I have it crushed," the billionaire CEO spat, adjusting her diamond-encrusted Rolex. The single-dad janitor didn't argue. He just smiled, turned the key, and the deafening, futuristic scream of a $2 billion prototype engine shattered the Silicon Valley silence. The fog had barely lifted off Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto, but the glass and steel monolith of Sinclair Capital was already humming with the ruthless energy of billion-dollar acquisitions. At the apex of it all sat Audrey Sinclair, a 34-year-old venture capitalist whose name sent shivers down the spines of seasoned tech founders. Audrey didn't just fund companies, she devoured them. Just last week, she had laughed representatives from major aerospace firms out of her boardroom because their profit margins on a new battery contract were a fraction of a percent too tight. She drove a custom, $3 million McLaren Speedtail, wore tailored Tom Ford suits, and operated with the chilling efficiency of a machine. 70 floors down, in the subterranean levels of the Sinclair building, operated a man who was entirely invisible to people like Audrey. Nathan Hayes pushed his industrial mop bucket down the long, sterile corridors of the executive parking garage. At 38, Nathan looked like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Because he did. His hands were calloused, deeply stained with grease that no amount of industrial soap could scrub away, and his eyes held a quiet, exhausted depth. He was a single father working the graveyard shift to keep a roof over his head and pay the astronomical medical bills for his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, who was battling a rare autoimmune disease. To the executives who occasionally saw him emptying their trash bins at 6:00 a.m., Nathan was a nobody, a ghost in gray overalls. But Nathan had a secret, one hidden beneath the faded, chipped grabber blue hood of a battered 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. That morning, the executive garage was chaotic. A water main break on the lower levels had forced the facility managers to reroute the night staff's parking. Exhausted after a grueling 12-hour shift buffing the marble floors of the lobby, Nathan had parked his rusted Mustang in an empty space on the VIP level, intending to move it before the executives arrived at 8:00 a.m. But a delayed plumbing inspection kept him trapped in the basement until 8:15. When Nathan finally emerged into the VIP garage, his heart sank. There, standing in front of his beat-up Mustang, was Audrey Sinclair. She was flanked by 2 nervous-looking assistants and her chief security officer. Her McLaren was idling behind her, blocked from pulling into its designated private charging bay by Nathan's car. The contrast between the two vehicles was almost comical. The McLaren was a sleek, aerodynamic teardrop of carbon fiber and engineering perfection. Nathan's Mustang looked like it had barely survived a demolition derby. The passenger side fender was entirely missing, replaced by a jagged sheet of exposed aluminum, and the paint was peeling like a severe sunburn. "Whose vehicle is this?" Audrey's voice echoed through the concrete cavern. It wasn't a question. It was an execution order. Nathan hurried forward, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Mine, Miss Sinclair." "I'm so sorry. There was a flood on level 4, and security told me to park up here just for the night. I'm moving it right now." Audrey turned slowly, her icy blue eyes raking over Nathan's stained uniform, his tired face, and then, with profound disgust, looking back at the Mustang. "You are a janitor," Audrey stated, her tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "And you decided that the best place to park this biohazard was in the spot reserved for the CEO of the firm that signs your pathetic paychecks. It was an honest mistake," Nathan said softly, keeping his head lowered. He had learned a long time ago that pride was a luxury a single father couldn't afford. Chloe needed his health insurance. He couldn't lose this job. "I'll have it out of your way in 10 seconds, Audrey scoffed, stepping closer to the Mustang. She kicked the front tire with the toe of her designer heel. "Look at this thing. It's leaking oil onto the imported resin floor. It smells like burning trash. That car is junk. It belongs in a scrapyard, much like the decision-making skills of whoever hired you." One of the assistants let out a sycophantic snicker. "I'm warning you," Audrey continued, leaning in close so only Nathan could hear. "If I ever see this rusted piece of garbage within a mile of my building again, I won't just fire you. I will buy the debt of whatever miserable trailer park you live in and evict you myself. Now get this eyesore out of my sight before I call a tow truck to crush it into a cube." Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't scream. A strange, fleeting smirk crossed his lips, so fast Audrey almost missed it. "Understood, Miss Sinclair," Nathan said quietly. "It won't be a problem." He walked past the billionaire, pulled open the creaking, dented door of the Mustang, and slid into the driver's seat. The interior was stripped bare. No leather, no radio, no passenger seat. Just a chaotic nest of thick, heavily insulated cables, exposed circuit boards, and a dashboard replaced by a single, high-definition military-grade telemetry screen. Nathan flipped 3 toggle switches hidden beneath the steering column. Outside, Audrey crossed her arms, waiting for the pathetic, sputtering cough of an old carburetor. She expected a cloud of black smoke and the embarrassing rattle of a dying engine. Instead, she got a shockwave. When Nathan hit the ignition, the Mustang didn't rumble. It shrieked. A high-pitched, harmonic whine like a jet turbine spooling up inside a vacuum echoed off the concrete walls. The air around the Mustang seemed to shimmer and distort, and the heavy concrete floor actually vibrated beneath Audrey's heels. It wasn't the sound of gasoline exploding in cylinders. It was the terrifying, beautiful acoustic signature of raw, unbridled electromagnetic energy. Before Audrey or her security team could comprehend what was happening, the rusted Mustang shot backward out of the parking space with a violent, impossible velocity. There was no wheel spin, no tire smoke. Just a blur of faded blue paint defying the laws of physics. Nathan threw it into drive. The car didn't just accelerate. It vanished up the exit ramp in a fraction of a second, leaving behind nothing but a strange scent in the air, not burning rubber or exhaust, but the sharp, clean smell of ozone. Audrey stood frozen, her hair blown back by the displaced air. The security guard's jaw was practically on the floor. What kind of engine was that?" Audrey whispered, staring at the empty concrete ramp. 70 floors up, in the glass-walled research and development lab of Sinclair Capital. Gregory Holt was having a miserable morning. Gregory was Audrey's chief technology officer, a former prodigy recruited directly from DARPA. He was the man responsible for evaluating the deep tech startups Sinclair Capital invested in. And right now, he was looking at a $500 million disaster. Sinclair Capital had heavily leveraged itself into a revolutionary electric vehicle startup called Aeromotive. The promise was a solid-state battery powertrain that could deliver 1,000 miles of range on a single 10-minute charge. But the prototypes were failing. The thermal runaway was uncontrollable. If they didn't solve the cooling issue by the end of the quarter, the startup would go bankrupt, and Audrey Sinclair would personally ensure Gregory never worked in the tech industry again. Stressed and heavily caffeinated, Gregory was standing on the lab's outdoor balcony, which overlooked the parking garage exit, trying to find an error in the thermodynamic algorithms on his tablet. Suddenly, the ground trembled. Gregory gripped the railing as a high-frequency acoustic wave slammed into the side of the building. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense, but it rattled the glass of the skyscraper and sent a painful spike of pressure into his inner ear. He looked down just in time to see a rusted, beat-up 1969 Mustang rocket out of the parking garage and merge onto Sand Hill Road. Gregory's eyes widened. He had spent 10 years at DARPA, working on advanced propulsion systems. He knew what a V8 sounded like. He knew what a Tesla Plaid sounded like. He knew what a Formula One hybrid V6 sounded like. The sound echoing down the street wasn't any of those. Driven by pure instinct, Gregory dropped his coffee, whipped out his phone, and opened a high-fidelity spectrum analyzer app he used to test acoustic dampening in the lab. He pointed it at the retreating Mustang, catching the last few seconds of its audio signature before it disappeared over the hill. He looked at the graph on his screen. The color drained from his face. No, Gregory muttered, tapping the screen to recalculate. That's statistically impossible. The waveform on his phone didn't show the jagged spikes of internal combustion. It showed a perfectly smooth, continuous harmonic wave, the exact acoustic footprint of an axial flux continuous plasma generator, a technology that was strictly theoretical. It was the holy grail of thermodynamics, a closed-loop propulsion system that required no external charging, generated zero heat, and theoretically produced enough torque to power a commercial airliner. Lockheed Martin had thrown $2 billion at the concept over the last decade, and failed. MIT had declared it structurally impossible due to the laws of entropy. Yet, Gregory had just recorded a functional prototype of it driving away in a car that looked like it belonged in a scrap heap. Breathing heavily, Gregory sprinted back into the lab. He threw himself into his office chair and hacked into the building's security network. He pulled up the thermal cameras for the VIP parking garage, rewinding the footage to 5 minutes ago. He watched the black and white thermal feed of Audrey yelling at the janitor. He watched the man get into the Mustang. But what Gregory was looking at wasn't the people. It was the heat signature of the car. When a normal car turns on, the engine bay immediately flares white-hot on a thermal camera. When a high-performance EV accelerates, the battery pack and motors glow bright yellow and orange with immense thermal dumping. On the video, when the janitor turned the key, the Mustang's engine bay didn't get hot. It went pitch black. It was absorbing ambient heat. The powertrain was operating at sub-zero temperatures, utilizing an endothermic reaction to cool the immense friction of its own magnetic fields. It was an engineering miracle. "Who the hell are you?" Gregory whispered, his hands shaking as he zoomed in on the janitor's face. He took a screenshot of the man and ran it through Sinclair Capital's internal HR database. A profile popped up. Name: Nathan Hayes. Position: maintenance staff. Level 2. Background check. Cleared. Previous employment listed as independent contractor. No higher education listed. Gregory frowned. That couldn't be right. A man doesn't just invent a $2 billion plasma magnetic powertrain while scrubbing toilets. Using his old security clearances, Gregory bypassed the corporate firewall and ran Nathan Hayes' face through a restricted federal database. For 3 agonizing minutes, the screen flashed, searching. Then, a redacted file appeared. The banner at the top read, Department of Defense, Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, clearance level, Omega. Gregory began to read, and his jaw slowly dropped. Nathan Hayes wasn't a nobody. 12 years ago, he was the lead engineer on Project Icarus, a highly classified initiative to develop next-generation energy cores for deep space satellites. He had been hailed as the greatest mechanical mind of his generation, a prodigy who saw physics not as rules, but as suggestions. But the file indicated a massive fallout. Nathan had discovered a way to miniaturize the core for civilian use, but a massive tech conglomerate had tried to seize the patent to militarize it. When Nathan refused to hand over the blueprints, he was blacklisted, framed for corporate espionage, and driven into absolute poverty. To hide from the conglomerate's lawyers, Nathan had dropped off the grid, taking menial jobs to survive. But he hadn't stopped building. He had spent the last decade secretly assembling his masterpiece, using discarded aerospace scrap and junk electronics, hiding the most advanced engine in human history beneath the rusted shell of a classic muscle car. Gregory! The sharp, angry voice shattered Gregory's focus. Audrey Sinclair stormed into the R&D lab, her heels clicking aggressively against the glass floor. She looked rattled, a rare crack in her icy exterior. "Audrey," Gregory said, quickly minimizing the classified file. "I was just about to come find you. I found the solution to the aeromotive thermal crisis." Audrey stopped, her eyes narrowing. "You did? How? 10 minutes ago, you said the battery chemistry was fundamentally flawed." "It is," Gregory said, turning his monitor to face her. On the screen was the high-resolution photo of the rusted 1969 Mustang from the parking garage. "We don't need to fix their batteries, Audrey. We need to buy whatever is inside this car." I just ran the acoustic and thermal analytics. Whoever built this vehicle has solved cold fusion propulsion. It's easily a $2 billion piece of hardware. I need to find the owner immediately." Audrey stared at the monitor. All the blood drained from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of Gregory's desk so hard her knuckles turned white. "Gregory," Audrey choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "That car belongs to the janitor." "I know," Gregory said, his eyes blazing with manic excitement. "Nathan Hayes. He's a genius. Where is he? I need to speak to him." Audrey slowly closed her eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over her. I just threatened to crush his car into a cube and told him to never come within a mile of this building again." Silence descended on the R&D lab, broken only by the hum of the servers. Gregory stared at his boss. The most powerful woman in Silicon Valley, who had just literally thrown away the most important technological advancement of the 21st century because she didn't like where it was parked. "Then you better hope he's forgiving," Gregory said coldly. "Because if Elon Musk or Sequoia Capital finds him before we do, Sinclair Capital is finished." The wind howling through the Sierra Nevada mountains sounded like a choir of the damned, but to Josephine, it was the only lullaby that mattered. It meant Clayton and his men couldn't track them, not in this storm. She huddled closer to the small, sputtering fire they had managed to build inside the abandoned mining cabin. The wooden walls groaned under the weight of the blizzard, dust and snow sifting through the cracks like powdered sugar. Across the flames, Wyatt was methodically cleaning his Colt revolver, his face a canvas of hard shadows and flickering orange light. He hadn't spoken a word since the shootout at the edge of town. He didn't need to. The blood seeping through the crude bandage on his left shoulder spoke volumes. "You should let me look at that again," Josephine said, her voice barely rising above the gale outside. Wyatt paused, his thumb resting on the cylinder. He looked up, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. "It's fine, Josie. Bullet went clean through. Just needs time." "Time is the one thing we don't have," she shot back, frustration leaking into her tone. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. "Once this storm breaks, Clayton will be back on our trail. He won't stop, Wyatt. You know him. He won't stop until he has the deed, and until we're both buried under 6 feet of Nevada dirt." Wyatt holstered the weapon with a sharp click that echoed off the rotting timber. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the grim set of his jaw. "Clayton is a greedy man, but he ain't a ghost. He bleeds like anyone else. If he wants to follow us up the ridge, let him. He'll find out exactly what waiting for him means." Josephine looked down at her hands. They were raw, calloused, no longer the hands of a wealthy rancher's daughter, but the hands of a fugitive. The deed to the silver mine, the very piece of paper that had started this bloodbath, was tucked securely inside her boot. It was her birthright, the only thing her father had managed to hide before Clayton's men burned their homestead to the ground. "I never wanted this for you," she whispered, the fight suddenly draining from her. "You were just the foreman, Wyatt. You didn't have to throw your lot in with me. You could have walked away." A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the crackle of burning pine. Wyatt stood up slowly, wincing as his shoulder protested the movement. He walked around the fire and knelt beside her. When he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tilted her chin up. "I didn't stay for the mine, Josie," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "And I sure as hell didn't stay to be a hero. I stayed because the thought of you facing those wolves alone, it wasn't a world I wanted to live in." The intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. For weeks they had been running, fighting, barely surviving. There had been no room for anything softer than survival. But here, trapped in the freezing dark, the walls between them finally began to crumble. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as a rogue tear slipped down her soot-stained cheek. Before the moment could go any further, a sharp, unnatural crack echoed from outside. It wasn't the settling of wood. It was the sound of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. Wyatt was on his feet in a fraction of a second, the tenderness vanishing from his eyes. replaced by pure, lethal instinct. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. "Get behind the old stove," he hissed, drawing his revolver. "Now." Josephine scrambled backward in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed her back against the rusted iron of the cast-iron stove, her hands instinctively flying to the cold handle of the knife hidden in her skirt. The wind howled again, but beneath it she could hear them. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling the cabin. "Wyatt," she breathed into the pitch black. "Quiet." His voice came from somewhere near the shattered front window. "Wait for my signal." The heavy wooden door of the cabin groaned. Someone was leaning against it, testing the lock. Josephine held her breath, closing her eyes tightly. The storm raged outside, but inside, the true nightmare was just beginning. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the rotting hinges giving way completely. A violent swirl of snow and freezing wind tore into the cabin, bringing with it the silhouette of a massive man. Before the intruder could even raise his rifle, Wyatt fired twice. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room in stark, blinding bursts of yellow. The man let out a wet gasp and crumpled backward into the snow. "Spread out! They're inside!" A harsh voice bellowed over the wind. It was Wade, Clayton's right-hand man. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the cabin, splintering the timber and raining debris down on Josephine. She curled herself into a tight ball behind the iron stove, covering her ears as the deafening roar of a Winchester rifle chewed through the room. Wyatt fired back methodically, shifting positions in the dark so they couldn't pin him down. He was conserving his ammunition, making every shot count. Another scream from the darkness told Josephine he had found his mark. "Josie!" Wyatt called out, his voice tight. "There are too many of them. We can't hold this box forever." "What do we do?" she yelled back over a fresh volley of lead. "The back wall." "There's a hatch leading to the old mine shaft. We have to take it." Josephine opened her eyes. In the dim ambient light, reflecting off the snow, she could barely make out the outline of the trapdoor Wyatt had spotted earlier. But to get to it, they had to cross the open room. "I'll lay down cover," Wyatt ordered. "When I say go, you run for that hatch, pull it open, and don't look back. Understand? I'm not leaving you." "You're not. I'll be right behind you. Get ready." Wyatt didn't wait for her to argue. He stood up by the window and unloaded his remaining rounds into the darkness, drawing every ounce of their fire. "Go!" he roared. Josephine pushed off the floor and sprinted across the cabin. Wood chips flew past her face as bullets punched through the walls. She threw herself onto the floorboards, her hands frantically searching for the iron ring of the trapdoor. She found it, hauling it upward with a desperate surge of adrenaline. The rusted hinges screamed in protest, revealing a pitch-black abyss that smelled of damp earth and old copper. "Wyatt, it's open!" she screamed. Wyatt turned to run toward her, reloading his cylinder on the move. But as he crossed the threshold of the door's sightline, a shadowy figure stepped into the cabin frame. It was Wade. "End of the line, boy," Wade snarled, raising a double-barreled shotgun. Josephine didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the throwing knife from her skirt and hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The blade caught the ambient light for a fraction of a second before sinking deep into Wade's shoulder. Wade roared in agony, his shotgun discharging wildly into the ceiling. The distraction was all Wyatt needed. He closed the distance, burying his shoulder into Wade's chest and sending them both tumbling out into the brutal snowstorm. "Wyatt!" Josephine screamed, scrambling toward the doorway. "Get in the shaft! Josie!" Wyatt's voice barked from the darkness outside, strained and breathless as he grappled with Wade. "Go!" She stood at the edge of the trapdoor, torn between survival and the man fighting for his life in the snow. She could hear the crunch of boots approaching rapidly from the tree line. Clayton's reinforcements were seconds away. If she went out there, they would both die. If she went down, she might lose him forever. Tears blurring her vision, she touched the leather of her boot, feeling the crinkle of the deed. She had to survive. With a heartbreaking sob, Josephine lowered herself into the pitch-black shaft, pulling the heavy wooden trapdoor shut above her. The chaotic roar of the gunfight and the howling wind was instantly muffled, replaced by the terrifying, suffocating silence of the underground. She was completely alone in the dark, and she had no idea if Wyatt was ever coming back. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't merely an absence of light, it was a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against Josephine's eyes and filled her lungs with the stagnant, copper-laced air of the deep earth. Above her, the heavy iron-wrought trapdoor remained shut, severing her from the howling blizzard, the deafening crack of gunfire, and the agonizing uncertainty of Wyatt's fate. For a long time, Josephine didn't move. She couldn't. She knelt on the damp, uneven rock floor, her hands trembling so violently she had to press them flat against the freezing stone to ground herself. The adrenaline that had propelled her across the cabin floor was evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying, hollow silence. Every instinct screamed at her to push the trapdoor back open, to crawl back into the crossfire and pull Wyatt to safety. But Wyatt's final, desperate command echoed in her ears. Go! If she went back up, Clayton's men would slaughter them both. The deed, the legacy her father had bled into the Nevada dirt to protect would end up in the pocket of a murderer. Swallowing a jagged sob that tore at her throat, Josephine slowly forced herself to stand. She reached out blindly, her fingers grazing the rough, splintered timber of a support beam. The wood was damp, covered in a thin film of cold slime. She trailed her hand along the bedrock wall, using it as a literal lifeline in the pitch black. She took a step, then another. Her leather boots scuffed softly against the loose gravel, the sound magnified 100 times in the cavernous silence of the abandoned silver mine. She remembered her father telling her about this specific shaft when she was just a little girl. It was one of the earliest claims, dug out by desperate men with pickaxes and black powder before the larger conglomerates moved in with their steam drills. It was a labyrinth of dead ends, unstable ceilings, and flooded drops. A tomb waiting for a mistake. Keep your hand on the left wall, she whispered aloud, her voice trembling, desperately needing to hear something other than her own frantic heartbeat. Always the left wall. It leads down to the main drainage at it. She inched forward, sliding her boots rather than lifting them to avoid tripping over unseen debris. Time lost all meaning. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours.
The cold of the subterranean world began to seep through her woolen shawl, chilling her blood.
The smell of old earth, rot, and oxidized metal grew stronger. Several times, her boot caught the edge of a rusted rail track, sending her stumbling to her knees, tearing the fabric of her skirt, and scraping her palms raw on the unforgiving stone. Suddenly, her leading hand grasped empty air. The left wall had vanished. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She swept her arm back and forth, finding nothing but the cold, damp void. She had reached a junction, a massive cavern carved out of the bedrock. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her chest. Without the wall to guide her, stepping forward meant risking a fall into an open shaft. She dropped to her hands and knees, sweeping the ground in front of her like a blind woman. Her fingers brushed against something hard and unnaturally smooth. Wood. Not a raw support beam, but milled lumber. She felt the edges. A crate. She crawled around it, her hands frantically exploring its surface. On top of the crate sat a heavy cylindrical object, glass and metal. A miner's lantern. Josephine let out a breathless gasp, her hands shaking as she patted down the area around the lantern. Beside it lay a small, rusted tin. She pried the lid off with a broken fingernail. Inside, she felt the rough, unmistakable heads of sulfur matches. She struck the first match against the stone floor. It snapped in half. She cursed under her breath, a violent, desperate sound, and pulled out a second match. She struck it with deliberate care. A brilliant, blinding flare of yellow and blue light ignited, banishing the darkness. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut against the sudden glare, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. Shielding the flame with her cupped hand, she brought it to the lantern. The wick was dry and charred, but there was still a slosh of kerosene in the reservoir. The wick caught, sending a steady, warm amber glow washing over the cavern. She let out a ragged breath, lifting the lantern high. The chamber was massive, held up by thick, creaking timbers that looked as though they could splinter at any moment. Rusted pickaxes, rotting coils of rope, and discarded wheelbarrows littered the floor. But what caught her eye was the tunnel entrance on the far side of the chamber. It sloped downward, perfectly arched, leading deeper into the mountain. Before she could take a step toward it, a sound echoed through the chamber. Thump, scrape. Josephine froze, the blood icing in her veins. She immediately reached for the dial on the lantern, turning the flame down until it was nothing more than a dying ember, plunging the cavern back into heavy shadows. Thump, scrape, cough. The sound was coming from the tunnel she had just navigated. Someone had come down the trapdoor. Someone was following her. She backed away, her boots completely silent as she slipped behind the massive wooden crate. She reached down, her fingers wrapping tightly around a heavy iron railroad spike lying in the dirt. It wasn't a revolver, but it would crack a man's skull if she swung it hard enough. She crouched low, holding her breath, waiting. The footsteps were erratic, heavy, dragging, and uncoordinated. If it was Clayton, he was walking like a drunkard. If it was one of his men, they were injured. A figure emerged from the black mouth of the tunnel, silhouetted against the absolute darkness behind them. They were leaning heavily against the rock wall, clutching their side. The faint, ambient glow from Josephine's lowered lantern caught the ragged edge of a canvas coat. "Josie," a voice rasped. The iron spike slipped from Josephine's fingers, clattering loudly against the stone. "Wyatt!" She scrambled out from behind the crate, cranking the lantern dial back up to full brightness. The yellow light illuminated the horrific state of the man standing before her. Wyatt's coat was torn to shreds, and a dark, terrifying amount of blood was soaking the left side of his shirt, trailing down his leg. His face was pale, his eyes glassy with shock and blood loss, but he managed a faint, grim smile. Josephine rushed to him just as his legs gave out. She caught him, the sheer weight of him sending them both sinking to the cavern floor. "You're alive! You're alive!" she sobbed, pressing her hands frantically over the weeping wound on his side. It looked like a blade had caught him between the ribs. "Wyatt, look at me. Stay awake," he groaned, his head lolling against her shoulder. Wade's dead. Left him in the snow." "And Clayton?" she asked, her voice cracking as she tore a long strip of fabric from the hem of her petticoat, desperately packing it against his wound to stem the bleeding. Wyatt gritted his teeth, his jaw clenching as she applied pressure. "Clayton. He saw me go down the hatch. He didn't follow." Josephine paused, confusion mixing with her terror. "Why wouldn't he follow? He has us trapped." Wyatt's ice blue eyes met hers, and the grim reality in them made her stomach plummet. "He's not coming down, Josie." He locked the trapdoor from the outside. Josephine stared at him, the horrifying realization washing over her. "He's not trying to shoot us anymore," Wyatt forced out, his breathing shallow and rapid. He sent his boys back to their saddlebags. "They brought mining powder, Josie, dynamite. They're going to blow the cabin and collapse the shaft entrance. He's burying us alive." A low, deep rumble vibrated through the bedrock beneath them, shaking dust from the ceiling timbers. It wasn't an explosion yet, it was the mountain settling, responding to the storm and the violence above. But the true blast was coming. "Then we have to keep moving," Josephine said, her voice dropping the panic and adopting a terrifying steel-edged resolve. She grabbed Wyatt's arm, hauling it over her shoulder. "My father said the lower adit connects to a natural cave system that leads out to the eastern ridge. We just have to find it." Wyatt hissed in pain as she forced him to his feet. "Josie, I can't walk that far. I'm slowing you down. Leave the lantern with me. You take the dark. You can make it." "Shut your mouth, Wyatt," she snapped, the fire of the frontier finally igniting fully within her. She wrapped her arm tightly around his waist, taking half his weight. In her other hand, she gripped the lantern handle with white-knuckled intensity. We walk out of this mountain together, or we stay in it together. Now move. Supported by her sheer will, Wyatt leaned into her, and together they turned away from the dead-end shaft. They stepped into the mouth of the descending tunnel, the flickering amber light pushing back the suffocating black. High above them, muffled by thousands of tons of Sierra Nevada granite, the faint, rhythmic sound of Clayton's men setting the charges began to echo through the rock. The fuse was lit. The race against the mountain, and the men who sought to destroy them, had truly begun. Will Josephine and Wyatt survive the dark labyrinth and outrun Clayton's dynamite? The frontier is unforgiving, but Josie's spirit is harder than the granite surrounding them. What do you think awaits them in the eastern caves? Drop your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this Wild West tale, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to catch our next thrilling frontier adventure. See you soon.